welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Entertainment Network. I am your host, Sarah. I am so happy to be with you on another Tuesday to bring you the first of two author interviews that I have this week. Both, interestingly enough, are epic fantasies, but very, very different in content, so that is fun. I'm looking forward to sharing these conversations with you. As we get started, as I always do, I would like to encourage you to like, subscribe, and or follow on whatever platform you are watching or listening to this podcast on. That really does help us to get the podcast out to more readers such as yourselves, and it is greatly appreciated. If you are also interested in helping the podcast in another way, you can do so by leaving a tip and donation at gsmcpodcast.info. This not only helps the podcast, but it helps the entire network and helps to get all of our podcasts out to more listeners and viewers such as yourselves. So if that is something that you are interested in doing, you see the link playing in the video next to me. Just go to gsmcpodcast.info and you can leave a tip or a donation, and it is greatly appreciated because it really does help the entire network. And I will just say thank you in advance if you decide to do that. I will say thank you as always for all of the support that you have given the podcast throughout its entirety and its different iterations. It is very, very much appreciated. So, epic fantasy. The first interview today is with author David Scidmore. We're talking about the second book in his ever-branching tree series. The first book is called Delia. The second book is called Aylun. Let me go ahead and bring up that graphic for you. So you can see the cover, and there's David and the cover. This is, as I said, the second book in his ever-branching tree series. The first one is called Delia. We do talk a little bit about that book as well, but the focus is more on Aylun for this conversation. And the description for Aylun is as follows. Megan had always lived life on her own terms, but faced with an impossible prophecy that threatened everything she loved, her choices no longer seemed to be her own. Aylun's world revolved around serving oracles and protecting prophecy, so his insights could be key to explaining the impossible. Yet, how could she force herself to work with the heartless tyrant who had so brutally abducted her? Megan was always good at solving puzzles. For years, she used that aptitude in a physics lab as an assistant to her best friend, John. In the midst of a chaotic day, an accident thrust them both into a terrifying alternate world. Almost at once, Aylun tears Megan from her best friend's side. Born and raised to be Shu, Aylun had always been an agent of the enigmatic home of all prophecy, the augury. His life had always been dedicated to serving as the invisible hand that carried out the will of the great oracles, past and present. Still struggling with the death of his sister and friends, a mission gone wrong results in his expulsion from the only home he has ever known. In search of answers, Megan and Aylun are compelled to undertake a mission into a place of unthinkable peril. As they struggle to find answers, John and his new friends, Delia, Garrus, and Kayleen, are drawn into a conflict with a dark and ancient menace that could obliterate everything and everyone they care about. As the puzzles deepen, the horrors multiply, and their situation grows more desperate. Megan's best hope to save them all and return her and John to their home world lies with the very tyrant who abducted her, Aylun. An epic high fantasy romance about ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances, Aylun blends alternate worlds, action, adventure, and dire peril with political intrigue and a pinch of humor. And so again, that is the description of Aylun by David Scidmore. The book that we are talking about today is part of the ever-branching tree series. This is, as I said, epic fantasy. This is the second in the series. The first book focuses on John and Delia and their story. Again, that book is called Delia, and we do talk a little bit about that. This story, the first half especially, really focuses on Megan and Aylun. Megan and John end up in this world at the same time, but they go on very different journeys. And Megan's journey is different from John's because this is very soon in the book, basically abducted by Aylun and another Shu, who are trying to protect her as well as figure out if she really is the subject of the prophecy, if she and John are the subject of the prophecy, and how best can they protect her and also protect that prophecy. So Aylun just ups and throws her on a horse and takes off with her, leaving John and a dragon. So their paths part very soon in the book, and then Aylun and Megan have to figure out what happens next, and they have to figure out how to work with each other, because as things progress, then their stories become, of course, more intertwined, and they have to figure out how to work with each other. They're both bringing in their own pasts, of course, as we all are, to the story, and their own issues and a lot of baggage that they both have. So they have to work through those and start learning to trust each other, learning to communicate with each other, figuring out ways to work with each other, because at first they're really just working at cross purposes. And it's interesting to see how that comes out. And then the second half of the book, we get more of John and Delia, and they mentioned Garrus and Kayleen as well. So there are 6 main characters and 6 different points of view throughout the different stories, and we learn more about those. There's also 3 couples. So Aylun and Megan are in their story together. John and Delia have a story where they're in together. And then Garrus and Kayleen, we start to get to know them a little bit in this second book. And again, we'll talk more about that as the interview happens. So let's go ahead now and turn to that interview with David Scidmore. Again, the series itself is called the Ever Branching Tree series, and the first 2 books in that are Delia and Aylun. Hi, David. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi. It's nice to meet you.
It's nice to meet you. I'm very happy to have you here. We're here to talk about some high fantasy, which is always fun. Before we get to the book, though, would you just take a few moments to share a little bit about yourself so my listeners could get to know you a bit?
Okay. My name's David Scidmore. I live in Verona with my wife, Brenda. Lived here for a while, probably 17 years. I used to live in Madison. I still listen to a lot. I used to be a musician of sorts for a while. When I was younger, still listened to a lot of music, enjoy it. In fact, some of the chapter titles come from songs, but I do a bit of gardening, things like that. And there's not a lot to say about me, and then at the same time, way too much.
That's always the trick with this question.
Right.
When you say you're a musician, do you sing? What instrument do you play? Tell me a little bit about
I play
that.
keyboards. I played in bands in high school and up into my early 20s, and then I started making money in electronics. And you just, in Madison, you just can't make money in music, really. There's just no avenue for exposing yourself. For you can't play out at bars or things like, you just don't make much money. So
Sure.
I sort of dropped out of that and just did it as a hobby for a while, and then I got really busy and didn't do it at all.
Yeah. But do you still play? Just for
I
you,
can.
or you
I
can?
can a little bit, not as much as I used to. I practice usually is what I do, because when you don't play, then you're rusty. So
Yeah.
instead of playing, I practice, and maybe at the end of practicing for a little bit, I'll pull out something and try to remember something that I was writing. I write music basically.
Okay.
So I'll remember something which is odd, because it's like I can't remember anything that I was doing. I'll just remember I was working on this song, and then I'll play a few lines of it, and over the next week, I'll remember more and more of it, and
The brain is amazing,
back to
actually.
you.
Yeah.
The brain cells are there, the muscle memory is there. You just got to tweak it a little bit.
Yeah. But it sounds like you're either music, and now you're writing, so that you've got the creative side to you.
Right. Well, actually, it's interesting, because when I was doing music, that's a very sort of direct emotional kind of contact. And you know how they use music in movies to heighten the music, the sort of the mood of the whatever's going on the screen. Well, that's because it's got a very, songs can be sad without any lyrics. They can be happy. They can be joyful and triumphant.
Yeah.
They can be all kinds of things. And engineering is sort of the other end of the spectrum, which is what I was, an electrical engineer. And it's very, a lot of planning and meticulous. And writing's kind of in between. You do a lot of planning to try to make sure the story is going to work.
Yeah.
That the things are going to go in the direction that you want. But when you're writing, it's a very emotional kind. You're trying to convey an emotion, not trying to you're not just doing something dry. In fact, I kind of do something that's a little odd. I do a lot of planning. I come up with a pretty complete scene list, although a scene list is just like a few sentences for each scene.
Sure.
But I come up with a scene list, and then when I actually sit down to write, I don't look at it for weeks at a time, and I'll just say, oh, that's right. So I think this was what was supposed to happen here. That'll be in the back of my mind, but whatever the characters do, that's what happens.
Mm-hmm.
And lots of times it's not exactly what I planned, and I have to make adjustments to my plan because the character didn't do what I wanted them to do. But
They're like that.
You got to stay true to the characters.
Yeah.
Whatever that person would do at that moment in time is what you got to go with.
Yeah.
So
do
it's
you
a little bit
have
surprising to me.
Oh, I was just saying, do you listen to music while you write, or do you have a soundtrack in your head as you write? Does that ever happen?
No, sometimes I listen to a lot of music. What happens is I'll run across a song, and the song will be and it'll just suddenly hit me. Wait a minute, this actually fits. Like for example, there's a song by a group called the Spock's Beard, and it's a little bit avant-garde, sort of progressive rock band. But it was called "Hiding Out," and it's about hiding out in a den of thieves. And it just kind of worked its way into the plot of the story. It was like a cool song, and I thought it was interesting, and I worked it in. In other cases, it'll be just like this captures the mood of this part of the and I don't necessarily try to use the lyrics or anything. I just kind of use the mood of the song to set the mood of the scene.
Mm-hmm.
But I use it in that sense, but I don't listen to it while I write. That would be too distracting.
Yeah.
But I usually kind of make myself playlists, and I'll listen to them before or after. Music is actually a really good way to sort of stir up the creative juices.
Mm-hmm.
I think because again, it's a very direct emotional experience. You listen to a song, it kind of has a sad feeling to it. You go, I'm going to capture that in this scene here,
Right.
and that's how I use it basically.
Okay. Makes sense.
But
So,
yeah, and then occasionally, again, I work things into the story just because they happen to work in, not because I'm trying to make that happen. But
yeah, makes sense.
actually, there was another song that was just blew me away because I ran across this song, and its lines were like, "There's no such thing as blank and total darkness," and I'm like, "Holy cow, that fits right in."
Yeah, absolutely. It's amazing how you notice those things, when in the context, it's like what yellow car syndrome or something like that when they talk about.
Right. At the time, I wasn't thinking about it. Then all of a sudden it hit me. Wait a minute. This is exactly what's going on in the story.
Yeah.
And so it kind of became the like the ending theme. Like that fits the end of the story.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway.
So this is the second book in a series, the Ever Branching Tree series.
Right.
Let's start with the series itself. Can you give an overview of the series?
It's about two people who are sort of thrust into an alternate world, which isn't a terribly unique idea. I mean, I guess two people is a little different, but I mean, like Wizard of Oz or Alice in Wonderland are both alternate world. I mean, they're long. They've been around forever. I mean, even like the Time Machine is a person thrust into an alternate world. So it's not a different idea. I'm sort of the opinion you're up against a wall if you're going to try to think of something that's no one's done.
Right.
There are billions of people on the planet. That's going to be hard to do. But so I just try to do a good job of it, really. But it's about two people thrust into an alternate world where they sort of got caught up in this prophecy. Which is a bit complicated because you don't know whether it's true or false. You don't know whether something's really going on. The people don't seem like they fit into the prophecy at all.
Right.
So it's sort of, on again, off again kind of thing. Mysteries pop up around it. And so that's sort of that's the center of things. That and that the main character, John, who is in the first book, centers around him, and the second half of the second book does kind of too.
Yeah.
He's not the kind of guy who would be a leader, and so it's kind of interesting. And I'm kind of a believer in that characters aren't static, that they kind of change and evolve and grow, and you can plan that out. And so he's a little bit, in the first story he moves in that direction, a little bit in the second story he moves in that direction. And then Megan is the other character who gets thrust into this world, and she's quite different. She's very independent, very outgoing, has a good sense of humor, and just doesn't really buy into this whole sort of prophecy stuff.
Yeah.
She doesn't buy into the whole world at first. She's kind of in denial, but then it's hard to deny what's in front of your face. So
Right.
she kind of eventually comes around, but she's a more different kind of character, and each character is different. They've got their own strengths and weaknesses.
Yeah, of course. So yes, when we first meet Megan, she is incredibly skeptical, which is understandable. I mean, she's thrust into this world that makes absolutely no sense. She has a logical and scientific mind, and now there's a dragon. I mean, that's the first thing they encounter is a dragon, and just this crazy world. Sometimes it's a little hard when you as the reader know so much more, and you're like, come on, just do you not see what's going on here? Why do you not believe this? But she's got to figure things out on her own as she continues in this world. So it is time for our first break of this episode. When we come back, we'll be talking more about Aylun and Megan as the main characters, especially the first half of this book, and their story as they try to navigate their path together. So stay tuned. You are listening and watching the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet, damn, ain't that great. I don't wanna go to work, cause my boss is a jerk, and I'm not even that paid. I need a change in my life, cause I don't feel alive, and there's nothing that makes me happy. Hold my beer for a minute, I'm about to quit my job, cash in for a ticket. I'm going on a trip and I don't plan to visit. I'm gonna stay there till I feel like I'm winning, and this is just the beginning. I need a big change, help me feel like living. I need a big swing, home runs I'm hitting, and I'll never look back, moving on till I get it all. And we all got dreams, we all want things, but what you gonna do for it? How you gonna move for it? What you gonna be? And do you believe you can do anything?
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. Before the break, David was talking about Megan and her entry into this world that she is very skeptical about. She doesn't understand all the rules and new things about this world that she has been thrust into. So we are going to continue talking about Megan and Aylun. Let's go ahead. But before we start that, I do need to remember to tell you that if you are a fan of this podcast and you would like to support it in a different way, you can go to gsmcpodcast.info, that link next to me, and leave a tip or a donation. That really does help not only this podcast, but the entire network. So if you want to help in that way by leaving a tip or a donation, just go to gsmcpodcast.info and you can leave that tip or donation and help out the podcast and the entire network. So now, as I said, we're going to talk more about Megan and Aylun's story together. Let's go ahead and return to the interview. Again, the author is David Scidmore. So the second book just is the more recent one, of course. It came out in October.
Yep. Right.
And Aylun is how I'm pronouncing it, but how do you?
That is correct.
Okay.
I try to come up with names that are hard to mispronounce, but not always. I mean,
Delia with fantasy, is the name of the first
book, but Delia is the name of the first book. Everyone wants to pronounce it Delia.
Delia, yeah, but there's two L's.
That's right. Well, and the thing is, actually, I would argue Delia is mispronounced because the name is derived from the Greek island of Delos.
Delos.
So it really should be Delia.
Yeah.
But okay. I don't know. I kind of put a bit in the book to try to explain the name. So
yeah, but people are going to pronounce them how they pronounce them, so you can't fully control that. True. So Aylun is the second part of this series, and we were introduced to John in the first one, but he's also got his story going on in this one as well. But initially, it's more focused on Megan and Aylun. So can you talk a little bit about their story?
Well, when I was writing the first book, at first, Megan wasn't, really way at the first, like, when the first month I was sort of thinking about this. She wasn't going to come along, and then it sort of hit me, well, it would be much more interesting if she did. But she couldn't stay with John because the story wouldn't work if she did.
Yeah.
So I had to think about how she was going to be separated from him. And then as you're writing it, you're thinking, okay, how is this going to work from both points of view? Because I started to think, okay, I'm going to tell her story. Because it's going to be a totally different story. And then that sort of evolved into, okay, well, how can I spin everything that happened in the first book into a different sort of perspective from her side that adds in things that you didn't know were happening. And so that's sort of where it went. But by the time I was in editing, I was pretty far into, okay, well, I'm going to write the first half is about Megan and Aylun, and then the second half is going to be all of them together. Mm-hmm. And so it's really two stories when it comes down to it. And the only reason I didn't, it's a really long book. It's too long in many ways. But I really wanted to write two stories, except the first one, I'm not really keen on, open-ended endings. So I didn't want to write a story that sort of everything's up in the air at the end. And that's kind of the way the first half ends. It does have an ending of sorts. You could put it on the shelf and go away and come back later and read the second half. But it's a little too much up in the air. And I wanted to just put the two together, which ended up being a long book. But think of it as two stories,
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense.
And the entire first part is told just from 2 points of view, which was also interesting because, writing from 2 points of view instead of 4, which the first book was.
Yeah.
It's a little more focused, and you don't have to worry so much about distracting from the main narrative that's going on.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit more about writing from multiple points of view? Were there any particular challenges with that?
Well, the idea sort of, I was learning as I was writing the first book. I was still learning a lot of stuff. I had studied a lot of story structure and how to make stories work, and stuff like that. I had my own ideas about how stories work just from observing stories. Mm-hmm. But I started to get into multiple point of view, and it occurred to me that Independence Day, the movie, was a multiple point of view story. There are multiple people in that movie, and they're all, you hear this, you see the story from these different points of view. And I thought, that's what I want to do. I want to tell a story not where there are just people there to give you information. The points of view aren't there just to present different information, but you're actually telling 4 different stories. Mm-hmm. So, I can't say all of them are great stories, but there are 4 independent stories going on. Each person has their own weaknesses and strengths. They face their own challenges. They each grow a little bit in the process. So it's 4 complete stories. And so that isn't so hard, except that when you're plotting, you kind of got to give equal time to all those stories. You can't just jump away from one for a while. And it doesn't always work out. I think Kayleen's story in the first book is a little weak because she's separated from everyone else. So mm-hmm. she's not sure what's going on. And to some degree in the second book, although she faces a little more challenges there, but from sometimes Garrus got a little way, you don't follow him too much in the second book. But he's a good character. In the third book, he's gonna be the center of everything. And I'm gonna do what I did again, I think, in the next book. And that's I'm not real fond of the structure because you don't want stories to seem episodic, like mm-hmm. you're telling 2 episodes. And that was kind of a challenge with the Aylun was that I'm telling 2 actually complete stories, but I don't want them to seem like 2 complete stories in a way. I want the thread to run through them so you feel like they're connected, and they're like you didn't just end one thing and you're starting a new thing.
Right.
And that's the same thing's going to happen in the next book. I'm going to follow what happened 15 years ago with Garrus and how he came to be banished and all that. But then I'm going to pick it up, and the same things that happened in the past are going to come back and kind of haunt everyone again. So it's going to be that'll probably be the last time I try to do this, where I tell two parts. But I wanted to have 6 characters who you could invest in, right?
Mm-hmm.
Everyone could have their favorite character. Everyone could, but I'm telling 6 different stories. Then since they're sort of couples, it's really just 3 stories.
Yeah.
So it's not as bad as it sounds. It's not as convoluted as it sounds. In fact, even in Aylun, John and Delia are never really separate stories. I mean, they're always together. They're always part of the same narrative, which is, in a way, how romance works. It's, you don't want to have the 2 people be torn apart for too long, or it just sounds like you're telling 2 different stories. Anyway, Aylun, telling stories from different points of view isn't really all that problematic. I just sort of approach it as each one story separately and then kind of blend them together.
Mm-hmm.
And like I said, the biggest challenge probably is not letting one narrative get away from you for so long that people lose interest in it.
How do you keep track of that in terms of everybody's stories and the timeline and where everything fits together?
Well, most of the work is done in plotting. I mean, I come up with the basics. I sort of approach things in 2 steps when I'm plotting. I come up with the basics of, okay, what is driving this character? What are the strengths and weaknesses of the character? How is that going to play into it? How's that going to make things hard for them? What challenges are they going to face? Who's the opponent here for each character? And then when comes time to convert those into like concrete moments, that's like the second step is, okay, all this is theoretical stuff, but I got to convert it into actually something that actually happens in the story. So I sort of build a trap for each character where things have to go down that path because of who they are and what they're facing. And then it's just sort of a matter of bringing all those things together at once and figuring out how each person is involved in each scene or group of scenes. So once that's done, the writing actually isn't that hard. Keeping track of it isn't hard either, because I got a scene list to work. I'm not doing it all in my head. That would be crazy.
It'd be amazing if you could keep it straight in your head.
Right. But and a lot of stuff happens because there's so many characters and so many things happening to so many characters. But at the end of the day, in the top of my mind is the idea that this is one story. I can't stray too far from that. They've all got to be involved in the story in their own way. And it's also important that each one of them contribute in some way, that the resolution of things depends on everyone. I sort of got that idea from thinking about, again, multiple point of view stories. Like if you go back to like even shows like Star Trek, each person has a strength or weakness that they bring to the, Spock is the cold, emotional, logical person, but he's also really strong with science. McCoy is the emotional one who kind of, and sort of looking at that, it's well structured from the point of view that each person has a reason for being there, and without them, the group isn't really complete. And that's sort of where I come from with multiple points of view. I want each person to have strengths and weaknesses and a reason to being there. And if you start from that kind of basis where you're looking at each character as they got to have a reason for being there, they have to have something they contribute to the group, then keeping track of them and what they do isn't all that hard, because when somebody's got to fight someone, well, that's a certain group of people. When a plan has to happen, when somebody has to come up with a plan, well, that's a different person. And when it's somebody who's figures things out, that's Megan, So it's sort of like, and John too, he's better in the clutch, he's better when a crisis occurs, and otherwise most of the time he's not that clever.
He's good in a crisis. Just don't ask him to like make a plan that it might have to come back to it's very complicated for people who are listening to describe John's character in terms of making decisions.
Well, he's a mix. Self-contradictory characters are great. I mean, he's at the same time a little bit awkward and shy and not on top of things, but at the same time he's really comfortable talking to people, and he in a crisis he really comes through. So he's like a mix of contradictory things. There he seems like he would be awkward and shy, but he's not always. He's sometimes really on top of things. And then Megan's the same. Megan's got her own self contradictions. She's really self-assured and independent, but she has a pretty bad background, a nasty background, where bad things happen to her when she's young. So she doesn't trust people really totally. So it's kind of a mix of things. On the one hand, she's really trusting, and on the other hand, she's not. And that's always good with characters.
Aylun as well. I mean, there's contradictions within each of them, because he can be very decisive, and he has, he knows what needs to be done, but he also gets locked into, he follows the rules, but he's had things happen that he's now very leery about getting close to people and making certain decisions. And
he got kicked out of the world that he knew. So of course he's both of them got kicked out of the world. Megan and Aylun both are not in their normal environment, and so they got to find their footing again. And I think that's a really awkward process for both of them, and difficult because they don't really trust each other. Well, not even close.
But they're thrust together, of course, as any good plot gives you.
Right.
They are shoved into this situation where they have to figure it out to work together.
Right. And that sort of evolves, and eventually they come to about halfway through, they come to a point where they're getting along okay. But that's where things sort of end, and then the second picks up.
Yeah. How about world building? This does not take place in our world. Megan and John end up in this other world. Can you talk about the world building process and how it works for you?
Well, again, I spent a lot of time thinking about stories, and a lot of time sort of coming to my own conclusions about how things work. And one thing I sort of noticed about good stories, and this comes from, again, sort of the 70s and 80s, when there wasn't a lot of serial storytelling on television. Things were episodic, they happened. And what you notice is that the best stories always happen in worlds where the possibilities are sort of endless, right? There's a certain amount of conflict going on. They're at a crucial moment in history. And so that sort of played into the process. I wanted a world where there were lots of possibilities, and I actually even haven't opened up that can of worms totally yet. I mean, there are things in my head that are going on in that world that then I think the editor gets, a little bit impatient with me, because I'm like, I don't want to go with that. I don't want to open that up right now.
Yes.
And he's like, well, why don't you? But there are things about the world that you don't know yet. A lot of that's going to come out in the next book. But it's a world of a lot of possibilities, and I think that's the important thing when you're writing a story, is to set the stage in a place where you're in tumultuous times. The world itself has a lot of possibilities to bring new stories in. When you're telling serial stories and you don't know exactly what happens in all the stories, you need to have a certain. I mean, I'll just pick a story out of the air. Harry Potter, right? She probably didn't know exactly what was going to happen in each story, but she set the stage right. She has the school, and she has these magicians. She has Voldemort, who's on the outside, and so you got this setup where if you can sort of have stories come up all on their own, because the environment around them supports that. So for me, that was a big part of it, and so I sort of did a number of things. One is this is a really much worse situation than it may seem like from the first two books. Because the world is more harsh, and it comes out more in the second book than the first book. The first book, it doesn't seem that bad, but in the second book, you meet this Dead of Night, which is a really nasty opponent, but it's not the only one.
It is time for our second break of this episode. We did kind of cut off in the middle of a conversation. We're going to be coming back to that conversation, but it was that the breaking point. He moves on to start talking about something else. So we don't continue talking about the dead of night, although the dead of night is very, very creepy, and it is not a place that you want to go. And no, it's not on my list of vacation places for sure. When we come back, we will be talking a little bit more about the cultures and the places that inspired some of the world building within the series. So stay tuned. You are listening and watching the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my conversation with author David Scidmore. We are talking about Aylun, the second book in his ever-branching tree series. Before the break, he was talking about the Dead of Night. That's where we ended the conversation, but we're talking about things that inspired the world and its culture and the things that you see within this world of the ever-branching tree. So let's go ahead and return now to the interview with David.
But the other thing is, I also had wanted to bring in different cultures, and so the world that Delhi is a part of is sort of based on the Spartan culture, which I really love. Partly because Spartan women were pretty fun. they're outspoken. What happened is the men would go into the army at the age of 7, and then the Spartan women would have to run the house. They ran everything. And while the men were off fighting, and so they grew to be pretty outspoken. They had no problems telling you what they thought. They learned to fight, they were, and so that's sort of that culture is rooted in that, comes from that. They came from Sparta, and I alluded in quite heavily, and not alluded, but pretty much said that they were Greek, but it's a very specific Greek culture. The rest of Greece wasn't like that, but Sparta was interesting in that way. So it's fun having those kind of women in it because they're just fun. Outspoken, kind of in your face. There's a line in one of the stories where John says, where Delhi asked John, well, why didn't you keep pursuing Megan? And he says, well, we have a name for people who keep following a woman who doesn't want it. They're called stalkers. And she comes back and says, we have a name. We have a name for that too. It's called asking to get the crap kicked out of you. Yeah. And that's just the kind of people she's used to.
Yeah, you don't want to mess with Delia at all. I mean,
or most of the people around her.
Yes,
the women around her. And then the other side was there's a sort of Hindi culture behind Urdan, the other realm. And then a Chinese one. China goes back forever in history, and so I'm constantly having to research. Okay, did they really know about cancer back then? Well, yeah, they did. They didn't know what it was, but they knew about it.
Right.
So all these things sort of you end up mixing together. So I sort of got three cultures that don't really work together, and that was in a way by design because I wanted to have sort of a reverse. Epic love story. And most epic love stories, you end up having the love crash and burn because the people can't be together because they've got larger responsibilities. But I want to do the reverse, which is that they have to be together because the world needs them. And so to do that, I wanted to make different cultures that didn't really mesh well. And so John is sort of the key to sort of making that all work out because the previous government wanted to rule all these with the same set of rules, and it just didn't work.
Right.
So that was sort of the idea, the genesis of the idea there. So lots of different things go into world building. But those are sort of the basics. A world that's got lots of possibilities. And again, you got to serve the story, so certain things have to come in that make the story work.
You've already mentioned the third book. So what's the arc? Do you have a certain number of books in mind, or are you writing until the story is done?
Well, probably writing until the story is done. I don't think it'll be done after the next book. But it's probably going to take a little while for John to come around to being the person he needs to be. So, and actually for all of them to come around to being, I mean, Megan's still a bit distrustful. She doesn't get, I mean, she likes Aylun, but she doesn't necessarily trust him totally. And so that's got to come around eventually. And they've got to grow into sort of a team that works together really well. And they're partway there, and they'll get better. But
they still seem to be working at cross purposes a lot.
Oh yeah. Well, they all got their own motives and reasons for doing what they do.
Yeah.
And in the end, though, they're going to all have to come together, and so that's going to take a while. And maybe a few stories. I'm not sure how many. Originally, I thought maybe as many as 8 or 9, but I don't know. It's not a trilogy, that's for sure. Although I am a believer that each story should end. I don't like open endings. I don't like cliffhangers.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason because it just seems like a cheap trick to me, right? I'm leaving you hanging so you'll come back and read the next book. But I watched Star Wars when it came out, and it was like I hated the way the second movie ended.
Yeah.
Because here, we have no idea what happens to Han Solo, and it's like you had to wait 2 years to figure that out.
And when you're a kid, that's a really long time. I remember it sucked.
Right. Yeah, it was a really long time, and so I just sort of figure I want to, and plus I guess I learned this from Buffy the Vampire Slayer more than anything, was that each season ended and it had a really great ending, and it felt really good that okay, everything was wrapped up, and you wanted to watch the next season because of how great the last one went. How so much crap happened, so many bad things happened, and in the end it all kind of settled out, and everything it had a really satisfying ending, and you wanted to come back and see more. And
right.
So,
satisfying ending, but the building blocks were still there. And that's the way I see the ending of this one is you wrapped up the big bad for this segment, but there's still things that need to be taken care of.
Exactly. And that was true. I mean, Joss Whedon is a genius. He's the one behind Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
Yep.
And he really knows, I mean, I learned in some ways from him how to put together a group of people. I mean, he was really great at that. And not necessarily from the same view as like Star Trek, but he has different people who have different values and beliefs. And those values and beliefs frequently conflict. Yep. And that's really great because it means in any conversation, something interesting could happen. Because these people don't agree, they could argue about something that's really meaningful for the story and meaningful in general.
Yeah.
You see that in even like the Avengers, where they're kind of like Captain America's arguing with other people on the team. He doesn't come at it from the same point of view as a lot of the other people. So you see conflict within the group, and I think that's really great because it also helps in creating sort of a moral theme for things, because they are arguing about something meaningful in terms of morality, and that comes through in the entire series. And that's just Joss Whedon. He's really great at that.
Yeah. So when it comes to writing, what do you think draws you to writing fantasy, especially high fantasy, epic fantasy?
Well, I read a lot of fantasy growing up, actually. First thing I read, and when I was really young, was the Wizard of Oz series. Most people don't know it was a series. But I read that when I was really young, probably even 8 or 9. And I read Lord of the Rings when I was early teens. Couldn't understand a lot of the words.
I was going to say, that's tough.
But I had a dictionary. I could look things up. There was no online dictionaries, but I could look things up in a dictionary. So I guess, and I read Alice in Wonderland. And I've always liked those kind of stories. The Time of the Dark by Barbara Hambly was a series I read that I really liked. And so the alternate world kind of thing was a thing I sort of fell into. Tolkien, perhaps, with Lord of the Rings, was one of the biggest influences. And I don't mean that in the sense that I'm trying to copy him, but I really liked that story. And so I think that drew me to that sort of field. I think that's more than anything, just reading a lot of it. I read a lot of sci-fi too. So, I mean, Asimov, and I guess I read a lot of Heinlein. It's odd because he's not really my favorite author, but I did read a lot of Heinlein. But fantasy has always been sort of a fascination of mine, especially alternate worlds. So it's just sort of came about naturally. I thought, well, why don't I tell this kind of story? And it was just a fanciful idea at first, but it kind of grew and grew until it sort of took over. And now I'm doing it sort of from a different perspective than I think I've seen before. But that's what it's about. It's not really that the core of the idea is all that new, but how do you do it?
And was writing something that you always wanted to do, or how did you decide that you had the story and you were going to maybe try to write for publication?
Well, I've always written a lot, but it wasn't fiction. I mean, I had to write a lot for my job, and I mean, all the time. So I was used to writing. I never thought I'm not that good at English. I couldn't. Not like my editor. They're on another level.
That's why they're an editor.
That's right. They see things I don't see. Like they'll say, you just said this and this. Did I really? But yeah, so I never really thought of myself as a writer, but I always sort of made up stories in my head. And again, I was involved a lot in music. And for a long time, I sort of didn't do that. And so when I got to a place where I was kind of decompressing from my last job, I thought about, well, okay, what do I want to do? And I just sort of, while I was thinking about it, started writing down actually turned out to be a screenplay for something. And I really enjoyed the process, especially dialogue. I like dialogue. I like it when people argue about things or discuss things, especially things that are complicated subjects where they each have their own point of view. I don't want to come across usually as advocating one of those points of view, although I do usually have an opinion, but I really want to give both sides of the argument a fair shake. And so that's always fun for me, is just looking at things from different perspectives and seeing different people's point of view. And I enjoyed the process. And so I just sort of said, okay, well, I'm going to write something else. And that was going to be another screenplay, but then it turned into a book, and that was Delia. So that was really my second attempt at writing anything significant. And so I enjoyed the process, again, because it's got both sides of things. It's got the engineering side of me that likes to plan things out and figure out how the story works. And then the other side is the creative side, which just throws it all away and just does whatever the characters are going to do.
No, it's kind of fun.
It is part of a philosophy that, at a certain point, art just has to be what it's going to be. You feed it what it needs to be to grow into the thing that it needs to be. You can't force it into your preconceived conception of what it's supposed to be.
Mm-hmm. I would imagine it's kind of fun, though, to write fantasy, especially with your engineering background, because engineering has specific rules that need to be followed. And with fantasy, sometimes you can ditch the rules a little bit. There are different rules.
That's very true. That's very true. If you really don't like the rules, and actually, I over time, it's been actually recently that I'm beginning to kind of understand actually at its lowest physical level. Because John's a physicist. At the end of the day, all this musing about why this world doesn't really work and doesn't make sense has to go somewhere. And that was something that I sort of realized in the last story. My editor kept saying, you should add more stuff where John's thinking about the world and how it works. And so I always like to point out these things where, okay, you can't just create energy out of nowhere. Dragons can't really fly. They're too big. But at the end of the day,
helicopters shouldn't fly either, though.
Yeah, kind of got to figure out a grand theory of why this actually happens.
Yeah.
And so I'm sort of on the edge of figuring that out. And that's fun for me. That's like, okay. So now that his musings are going to have a new direction when it comes to the next story. They're heading somewhere.
Yeah.
But that's fun, is trying to figure out, okay, if fantasy really existed, how would it actually work?
How would it work? Yep.
At the lowest possible level, not even Newtonian physics, but like quarks and those kinds of things. And so I'm learning a little bit about physics. It's a part of the process, because I got to figure out, how does this all really actually make sense in the end?
Yeah.
So it's fun. Those kind of things are fun to me.
I would imagine. Yeah. Do you have advice for authors who might want to try writing fantasy?
I'm not really, I've said before, I'm not really in a position to give people advice, but I would say there's general advice I can give anyone. Work hard, keep working at it. The more you do something, the better you get at it. And that's really the best advice I can say is think about stories, spend time working on them, understanding how they work, what you're trying to do in your own story, and just keep working at it. That's probably the best advice you could give. And it's true everywhere. I mean, it's not just writing. If you're going to be a musician, practice a lot. It'll serve you in the end. If you're going to be a writer, write a lot. It'll serve you in the end. And spend a lot of time thinking about not just writing, but also thinking about how you want things to work and how things have worked in other stories and what makes this story appeal to you. What makes this other story not work. I mean, don't spend as much time thinking about things that don't work as you do about why you really liked this or that.
Yeah.
Because I think in there are answers to deeper questions that can help you become better at what you do.
It is a valid point. I mean, if you're going to do something, do it a lot, regardless of whether that's writing or playing an instrument or learning a new craft or skill. I mean, it really is good advice for whatever you've got going in your life. So we are going to take our final break of this episode. When we come back, David will be talking about what he likes to read in his spare time. So stay tuned. You are listening and or watching the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back after these breaks. This break, not breaks, break. Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion of my interview with author David Scidmore. Before the break, he was giving his advice for aspiring authors, or really good advice for anything that you want to do and hopefully do well in life. So let's go ahead now and return to that interview to wrap things up. You have mentioned Tolkien and Alice in Wonderland, Wizard of Oz, those books that you read growing up. What now are some of your favorite authors and genres when you're just reading for your own enjoyment?
I still like Stephen King. He's a great writer, and what's great about him, there's always something to learn from good writers. And the thing about Stephen King is he just has a real way of telling the story. The words he puts down, his narrative is just amazing. I mean, he can take something that's not all that interesting and make it really interesting just by the way he describes it. he's a great writer. So I recently read The Stand. I really enjoyed that. Brandon Sanderson, I've been reading a bit of him, mostly because he's really popular.
A bit. Can you read a bit of Brandon Sanderson?
Well, he's got a lot to read.
Yes.
I read his first story, which was instructive because he's grown a lot as a writer as time has progressed. But I've read some Brandon Sanderson. I like him. He's a good writer. He's got a certain style that's interesting. You can learn something from it. He has this way of, well, for one thing, his process of world building something on another level entirely. Mm-hmm. I mean, he constructs these worlds with these elaborate rules about magic. They're really interesting, and a lot of people really like that. I mean, to me, I'm more interested in the people and how they work than I am about things. I'm a little strange that way for a guy. Most guys are more attracted to things like how things physically work. I'm more interested in how people work and how they interact with one another. But he's really great with the physical world, how the physical world works. How does this magic work in this world? Mm-hmm. And he's really good at sort of spinning a tale where at the end, there's all these revelations that just pop up one after the other. And you sort of begin to understand, okay, this is what's really happening here. And he's good at that. A few different things, but those are probably the two things that I've been focusing on the most. I mean, I read the Ramayana, which is I don't know if I got that pronounced correctly, which is a Hindu script, just because I want to understand the culture more. You know, and I started, I read a little bit of The Journey to the West, which is a really great Chinese classic story, but it's a comedy, so it's really fun. Nice. There's so much stuff that comes from that, and when you learn a little bit about their culture, you learn how deeply embedded the Journey to the West is in everything. Not in everything, but in a lot of what they all know who the great sage equal of heaven is. You know, who's a monkey who's really kind of mischievous.
I was gonna say he's a trickster a little bit, right?
What?
He's a little bit of a trickster, isn't he?
Oh yeah, he's quite the trickster, yeah, and he's got an unconventional sort of way of thinking about things, like basically he's the center of the universe, but he's a fun character. So you know, I've done a little bit of that and different things. So yeah, that's basically what I've been reading lately. Okay. Brandon Sanderson is, I mean, he's written so many things I don't think I could begin to read them all, but.
It's an amazing.
But he's a great author. Yeah.
For people who might want to know more about you and the series, website, if you can share your website and any social media that you're active on.
I have a website, davidscidmore.com, which is just my name.com, and no punctuation, just all one word. And but you won't. I don't post there. I got to admit, I'm really bad at social media. I mean, I could be involved more. I'm not really, somebody asks this question, maybe a month later, I'll get back to it. And I apologize for that. It's just that I devote my time more to writing than I do to social media. It's just, I guess on one level, I'm a little afraid that it can be if I get into it too much, which is definitely a possibility, that it will consume massive amounts of time. Yeah. So it's kind of something I keep a little bit at arm's length, and sometimes that translates not even looking at it. So I do have a Facebook page. You can go and look there, but the last post was months ago. So
yeah, it's fair enough. Fair enough. I mean, you just wrote a 1,000-page book. You've got something else that's got to give, right?
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. David, we've covered a few different things during this time together, but is there anything that we have not touched on that you wanted to make sure you highlighted?
Not really. I think it's been fun talking to you, and it's always fun talking about stories. I love talking about stories.
Well, thank you for talking to me about your stories, for talking to me about the series, and especially Aylun and the characters. I really, really appreciate your time.
Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you so much once again to David for joining me to talk about Aylun and Delia and the Ever Branching Tree series. This is epic fantasy. The first book is somewhere around 650 something pages, and the second book is over 1,000, just over 1,000, like 1,030 or something along those lines. So if you are a fan of epic fantasy and you love having a good solid book of lots and lots of pages to read, then you should definitely check out this series. The first two are available. There will be more, as you heard David talking about. So, you may want to jump in right now and read them and then wait for the rest, or you may want to just check them out and see if you want to wait until there are more. I mean, that's really up to you. You know how you read. Sometimes I don't wait and I jump into a series, and then of course we have to wait, but patience, right? It's good for us, supposedly, to wait for things that we are looking forward to. But if you're a fan of epic fantasy, and this story with Megan and Aylun is enemies to lovers, or at least enemies to working their way toward being lovers, and probably but working their way through their trust issues. If you are a fan of these stories, or if you have someone in your life who is a fan of fantasy and want to check out the series for them, then definitely check out David's work. I hope that you will also join me for the next episode. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is my second epic fantasy of the week. I'm speaking with Andrew Dolberg and Rob Long about their book, The Great Weather Diviner. The subtitle is the untold story of Punxsutawney Phil. So if you are familiar with the Groundhog Day lore in the United States, February 2nd, and the way we wait for Punxsutawney Phil is a groundhog who lives in Punxsutawney, and he comes out, and depending on whether or not he sees his shadow, we decide if we're having 6 more weeks of winter. Well, this is the untold story of those origins, and it is so much fun. Look at the artwork. The artwork is just fabulous, and it is, it's, like I said, it's epic fantasy, but very different from what we talked to David about today. This is middle grade or younger readers. It could be read as a family. It talks not only about adventure and the hero's journey, but also climate change, issues of leadership, and all sorts of great lessons that Phil and his Junior, he goes by Junior or Phil, mostly Junior, but everything that Junior learns through this adventure of trying to help save his town when disaster strikes and there is a flood. So join me for that interview. I am looking forward to sharing that with you. Again, that will be on Friday, so come join me for that interview. In the meantime, I hope you're having a great week. If you have not done so already, please do like, subscribe, and follow this podcast on whatever platform you are listening or watching it on. And you can also follow the podcast on social media. Come find it on Facebook, X, Instagram, and TikTok. I say it every week because I mean it every week. I love to hear from listeners. So if you've heard an interview and you've read the book, or you want to read the book, let me know. I would love to hear from you. Or if you just want to hit me up and tell me what you've been reading, love to hear that as well. I'm very nosy about books, as you hear every week when I ask everyone, what are you reading? What more can I add to my ginormous TBR that I will never ever get to? I think you know how dragons hoard things, shiny things? I think I just hoard titles for my TBR. I think that's what I hoard. I'm okay with that. I hope you're having a great week, but regardless of what your week is involving, I hope that it affords you plenty of time to get yourself lost in a good book or a couple of good books. Talk to you next time. Thank you so much.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet, damn, ain't that great. I don't wanna go to